the fourth in our series of Human Brophy political interviews about Britain's political and economic future. My name is Mark McGregor, and I'm chairing the event today. Now we're holding this series. In fact, we started the series at the middle of last year because, I mean, rightly, the attention of business and government has been focused on COVID for the last 2 years, and that inevitably squeezed out the ability to look much beyond that. And with the start of the new year and the lifting of almost all COVID restrictions, the success of the booster and the like, this does seem to be the right time to look at the future. I'm also hoping, with all the other debate in Parliament and all the other issues going on there, that it might also serve as a partial distraction from events in Parliament over recent weeks. We will see if that is possible. The interview today was framed around discussing how Britain could balance its ambitions to be global Britain against the need to grow the economy here, if indeed those things are actually in competition. And when we first imagined the event, I think most people would have imagined we'll be talking against a backdrop of high unemployment, failing companies, slow recovery. And whilst there's certainly been a big impact of COVID on certain industries like travel and the like, and certainly on government finances, in terms of the wider impact, the speed of the bounce back is the thing that actually now seems to be causing some of the economic problems. Energy pricing, supply constraints, high level of vacancies. Many of these issues, of course, touch on exactly the subject for the discussion we envisage for today. You take the shortage of staff in certain areas, HGV drivers, for example. What is best for Britain? You know, we were discussing just before the call started, you know, if Britain reaches trade agreements with other countries, that might require greater ability for people from those countries to come here. How do you balance that with Britain's determination to keep its borders tightly closed? And how that tension plays out in future in everything from trade deals to levelling up investment, that's really what we wanted to sort of cover today. Our interview for the whole series is Lord Finkelstein of Pinner. Danny Finkelstein is Times columnist, former advisor to William Hague and David Cameron, chair or ex-chair of a number of the most influential think tanks, and author of Everything in Moderation, a book containing a collection of his articles over the past 2 years. For anyone who did miss any of the previous events where Danny interviewed Andrew Griffiths, for example, about reputation, and Greg Clark actually about levelling up, you can catch up again on those interviews on our LinkedIn post. And the politician we have asked, I hope timely, in a timely way to interview today, brings what I hope is a kind of unique perspective to the issue. Over the last 20 years or so, Damien Green's held a very wide number of roles under 5 different leaders, as shadow minister or minister covering transport, education, policing, immigration, pensions, and then, of course, First Secretary of State under Theresa May. So his perspective, I think, will hopefully inform the discussion. Before handing over just to Danny, one small piece of housekeeping about the format for today. Danny's interview will last for about 30-35 minutes, and then we hope to have time to take questions at the end of that discussion. Because we are limited on time, if you want to ask a question or make a point, and we want to try and cover as many of those as possible, please post them below in the Q&A, and then we'll try to get around to as many of those as we can. So thank you very much for joining us today. Danny, over to you.
Well, Mark, thank you very much indeed. Damien, welcome. I thought that it would be the right thing to do just to begin by saying there's an awful lot going on in Westminster. Before we move on to the main topics that we're going to discuss, just to tell me what the feeling is in Westminster, and make some comments about the current situation, maybe.
I think the appropriate and afternoon, everybody. I think the appropriate cliche to reach for is febrile. Though not today. It's one of those collisions of the sort of best and the worst about Parliament, that one of the reasons why the Sue Gray report is not coming out today is the parliamentary reason that the Speaker said he knew that so many of us, including me, are in their constituencies because we have Holocaust Memorial Day events that we didn't want to miss, that he wasn't going to let the government make an important statement today. So that's contributed to the fact that we're not going to get this report till Monday. And therefore, where we are is in a very peculiar long pause for breath. where that we all want to see this report, and a lot of people are genuinely saying, okay, let's actually have some authoritative reporting of what went on before we in this case being Conservative MPs will decide what best to do. And you will all have observed there's been a huge amount of campaigning for and some against the Prime Minister from inside the Conservative Party all week, and where it goes is hugely dependent on the Sue Gray report. The other question everyone asks is, well, won't you have to wait till the full police inquiry? And the answer may well be no. It depends what's in the Sue Gray report, and I know that's become every politician's go-to phrase of the last week or so, but it's true. Until you've got something authoritative out there, then you're jumping the gun a bit either way. It's clearly both. In a way, it's one of those paradoxes. In a way, I get the argument that it's all a bit trivial, because there are 100,000 Russian troops on the Ukrainian border, and we're discussing cake. But nevertheless, actually having trust in democratic institutions and the rule of law applying to all of us, otherwise it's not really the rule of law. That goes to the absolute heart of any advanced democracy. So it combines triviality with some of the most serious issues you can have in a democracy.
Thank you. Well, let's get into the issues that we were discussing today. And I wanted to start with a sort of very broad point of principle from which we can then advance. What is the argument against just having world government?
The argument against is sort of the way the human race forms its loyalties, I suppose. If it were the case that we all felt an equal mutual obligation to every other human being on this planet, then you could organize a world government in theory. In practice, there will be practical difficulties, of course, as well. But we just don't. We are hardwired not to. And we all know that nation states grew from families banding together to form tribes, and tribes banding together to form countries. And some of it is evolutionary biology, and as it were, the rest is history, to coin a phrase. And therefore, it is simply impractical to remove from humanity the clashing loyalties that people have, and people are quite used and deal in an instinctive, non-intellectual way with conflicting loyalties, which they balance against one another. But in the end, there are very, very few people, I would submit, on this planet who genuinely think I care as much about every other human being as I do about those who are near to me, those who have either literally shared my upbringing or share my language, general outlook, social history, and all of that.
Okay, so that is sort of establishes the base that we can't just give up all of our laws and have a world government, and leads directly into this famous word, which you'll be familiar. Maybe you could tell us a bit about from your time working in the policy unit for John Major, subsidiarity, and that is that the idea that the right measures will be considered in the right place. The problem with that is almost every measure you can justify it being made at international level because there are so many spillover effects, and yet, as you just said, people don't want that. So how did you in practice, and how might you in theory start to decide where is the correct place for a decision to be made?
Subsidiarity, you mentioned, I worked in John Major's policy unit before I became an MP, and obviously I spent a lot of time grappling with Maastricht, and that was the point where the European Union had introduced the concept of subsidiarity, which I think comes from Catholic social teaching originally. And it's not just that the decision should be made at the right level, but there's a prejudice, if you like, there's an instinct towards taking it at the most local level. And clearly the bigger the overall governing unit you want, i.e. the European Union, say, then the more levels of subsidiarity you need. And how you go about deciding what the best level is depends on things as fixed as geography as much as anything, as well as the practicality of how large an organization you can effectively run, and in particular where you put some democratic legitimacy. If you want to live in a democracy, then people who need to have some sort of feeling that they can have some influence, or that the services they are being provided by the state are in some way tailored in a way so that it's suitable for delivery in their area. I'm conscious this is all sounding tremendously abstract, so let me try and make it concrete. One of the live debates I had when I was police minister, and it's still a sort of live debate, though it's gone away, is how many police forces do we need in Britain? In Scotland, they have merged I think it was 5 police forces into one. There is Police Scotland. And to be honest, they did it 10, 12 years ago, and the results are mixed. There's no obvious feeling that policing in Scotland's got much better. And they made all the arguments you make about one organisation, better purchasing power, cleaner lines of command, all that kind of thing. Whereas there are dozens in England, and a lot of senior police officers, when I was police minister, said, if you were being rational about it, you'd have somewhere between 5 and 8 police forces in England and Wales. But we've got 30 plus, and the argument against was in sort of in not quite theoretical terms, but in emotional terms, really, was that, well, people in Kent, where I am at the moment, like to have the Kent police. They feel that's local, and they don't want that to be merged into a sort of greater Southeast police, still less taken over by the Metropolitan Police. And to be honest, in that area, I would slightly come down on the side of change, in that a sensible Suffolk copper once told me, you know what, if you're living in a farmhouse on the Suffolk-Norfolk border and you get your barn burgled, and within half an hour a copper turns up, they're not looking at the badge to see whether it's Norfolk or Suffolk police. They just want the police. And I suspect that's true. So in that area, probably subsidiarity would actually be a less local level than we operate it at the moment. I'm trying to think of other government departments I've been involved with. At DWP, we have job centres in every town in the country, but that's entirely sensible. That sort of has to be run as a national service, because you probably don't want a different benefit system in Bath than you have in Harrogate. We pay the same benefits. They're paid out of national taxation. They've got to be paid on a national level. So on that basis, you have a local arm of a big national body. So there is no, as you would expect, easy answer to this. That different circumstances of different organisations require different levels of subsidiarity.
Okay, so let me give you an example. A man is going to kill another person, and you think I should stop that from happening. But now I tell you a different thing, that the man who's killing the other person is a Ukrainian, and they're going to kill another Ukrainian. How much of that is our business? Okay, so the Second World War seemed to teach, well, we can't just allow people to say it's my business if I want to kill, or it being Holocaust and Horror all day, all of our Jews, or to allow the Soviets to say we can deport all of our Poles from Eastern Poland. So where is our responsibility? Someone like Simon Jenkins in The Guardian says, why on earth are we concerned about the democratic rights of Ukrainians? What is the appropriate level of involvement and concern of Britain for human rights abuses or other abuses taking place in other countries that aren't directly our citizens?
It's oddly enough, I think we end up having more legal responsibility than moral responsibility, if you like. In a sense, in as much as we all do feel that no man is an island and we have some kind of responsibility around the world, that there would be a pinprick of, we need to do something about this, about atrocities happening anywhere in the world. But I think the legal form that's taken is, to revert to your original question about can we have world government? Well, no. But what we can have are organizations, and in particular treaties, that we as a country have signed and that other countries have signed, which very often those other countries don't live up to. And when they're not doing that, we've signed a treaty as well. So it seems to me we have some kind of legal responsibility or almost as a legal right to try and pursue in some form or another the appropriate way that people not only should behave. It's not a moral thing, but they have promised to behave. They've signed these various treaties, which include declarations of human rights and so on. And so it behoves us to try and get other people to live up to them. Clearly the practicalities will differ depending where in the world it is, but that international framework of encouraging sovereign states to sign treaties with each other so that the world is a less anarchic place than it used to be, it seems to me an advance. And although it's impossible to look around the world and feel cheerful at the moment about geopolitical developments, we still sort of just about work under the post-World War II framework where international treaties can have some effect on behavior.
Okay, let's move to a slightly different question, which is the question of political accountability. It's raised a little bit by both the answers that we've discussed. One of the problems with global government is the trying to call anybody who is involved in it to account. This can be the European Union's solution to this was to create a single parliament and try to create these kind of very unwieldy voter coalitions across European countries, which included, you'll be familiar with it. I'm sure that we've both been at events from the European People's Party, which it can include a lot of parties that really didn't quite correspond to the British Conservative Party, for instance. And most people didn't know what that was, so it didn't really have any sense of actual accountability to them. And they couldn't do the other democratic thing, which was kind of get rid of the rulers, since there was a proportional system, and it seemed pretty much that there was a kind of bureaucracy that rolled on forever. And all this contributed to the Brexit vote. Admittedly, that's at the sort of more theoretical end, but it did contribute to it. And then the alternative to that is we have international bilateral meetings. The governments are sovereign, but there's a sort of vacuum at the center. It's difficult. None of these countries are accountable to each other. There's no overarching vote. The bureaucrats are completely unelected. There's no European Council to run it. So how do you make account? What is the right solution if these two solutions aren't quite right? What is the political accountability in a global world?
The political accountability is within each country. And I mean, you say we've both been to EPP events. I haven't been to an EPP event for 17 years because David Cameron pulled the Conservative Party out of the EPP, which was a sort of one of those very small decisions taken during a leadership campaign, which had, in his case, existential consequences for his political career 11 years later, when, I agree with you that it was a very minor contributor towards Brexit, but it certainly contributed very much to taking the Conservative Party out of the centre-right European mainstream for a decade, which I think itself contributed to shifts in the Conservative Party. But anyway, this is raking over old and unhappy ground. So let me address your question directly. I think the accountability does have to come through international agreements. There isn't an international polis. The point was made through the point you're making. That you form large groupings of overlapping political parties across the European Union, and then they each have a candidate for the presidency of the Parliament, and that is the person people are supposed to be voting for. This is just laughable nonsense. I don't suppose anyone in any European election knew who the Spitzenkandidat was. Certainly not in the UK, and I'm not sure how many in other countries as well. So that doesn't work. But what does work actually is government signing treaties with each other. And let me pick a very difficult example, which is counterintuitive for many people, which is that Britain and France signed the Touquet Treaty about illegal immigration across the Channel in 2004. And for all the stresses and strains, which are worse now than ever before in that nearly 20-year period, the French have kept to that. The French do try and stop people coming across the Channel illegally. They do clear the camps regularly, even now. And essentially, they're doing that, okay, it's partly for their own benefit, because the burghers of Calais don't like having large camps of asylum seekers on their doorstep either. But, there is a sort of image promoted in parts of the British media that the French are just welcoming these people in to shovel them food, to annoy us. Actually, a government there, as I say, successive governments of different stripes in France have more or less, tried their best to keep to that treaty. So I think you can sign international treaties, and beyond that, you can sign, multilateral agreements on matters as vague as human rights, and you can set up international courts. The International Court of The Hague does actually prosecute some war criminals, and they end up being sent to jail. Of course, in the end, you need some hard power behind that, and that's what you often sort of people tiptoe around. But you can set up as many courts as you like, but if you have a rogue state that's determined to ignore international law, then it will get ignored, and at that point, the rest of the world community, or part of the world community, has to decide: are we going to put up with this, or is it worth trying to intervene directly? And you can make you can have different views about the Iraq War, the failure to intervene in Syria, the intervention in Afghanistan, which we clearly pull out of, we the West pulled out of in a humiliating, failed way. So each intervention you can assess before and after, but unless you've got the power to make that intervention, then in the end, of course, all those treaties are words.
Yeah. So let me just sort of wrap that with a question about global free trade, because I suppose someone like Sir Ivan Rogers, who was our EU negotiator for a period, then resigned, he would sort of argue, by the time you have all the obligations of global free trade, you're sort of reinventing the European Union. In other words, for all that we've talked about the need to not, to have subsidiarity in local government, and then people rejected the European Union because it didn't give them that and people wanted it. Isn't the problem with global free trade that you enter into a whole network of agreements, and they either don't amount to much cooperation, or if they do amount to much cooperation, they then just reinvent what we've just left?
Yes, I mean, let me try and put a point of view that sort of where I spent years of my life arguing against. Those who don't know, I was on the board of the Stronger In campaign, so you, as it were, know where I'm coming from on this. But the Brexiteer argument would be, why is it, to answer the question, why is it better to sign global trade deals? Why don't we just stick with the EU and all those obligations, irritating now some of them are? Their answer would be, we can in each case sign a deal where intelligent ones would admit, of course, we're going to have to give something up. And Mark mentioned a possible Indian trade deal. It's clear the big demand of the Indian government will be a higher capacity to get visas. There are lots of Indians who want to come and work in this country, and the Indian government will demand that absolutely as a big concession from the UK in any kind of trade deal. And there is a perfectly rational case to say that's absolutely a price worth paying to the growth of the Indian middle class means that British insurance companies could have a fabulous market there, and the net gain to the UK economy would be quite considerable from an Indian trade deal. But in the end, it's a deal. So yes, you have to sacrifice something, and to sort of continue with the Brexiteer argument, therefore, now you have to put it through the British House of Commons. It's not just been negotiated at a European level where we've sort of handed power away. Other people negotiate a European Union deal with somebody, and we just have to take it. So at least the British House of Commons will have to approve all these trade deals. And we haven't yet got to the stage where we've addressed that, because we haven't put any of these trade deals yet to the House of Commons, because basically the dozens that have been signed are all just rollover deals, and every one of them will be controversial. And I think partly because the Australian one is the easiest one. It was always said rightly, this we're friendly countries, we get on, we know what they want, they know what we want, and we can sign that trade deal, and we have. And already you detect the unease in British farmers about the Australian trade deal. So every trade deal is going to have a tough fight through the House of Commons, even though any economist can show you how much it benefits even when you're giving up, and the government will produce impact assessment showing that there is a net gain, but we all know that losers shout louder than winners, and so that will happen. So one of the things I predict about Parliament for as far ahead as the eye can see is that the British government will keep signing trade deals, hopefully bigger and bigger trade deals, and each one of those will be extremely controversial to get through the House of Commons.
Yeah, I think that's right. Now let me deal with sort of one of the issues that remains as a residual from Brexit. One of the sort of concerns is that the political damage in our relationships over leaving, because they were so resistant to it and because they've got their own concept, have now been so bad that that we're quite reliant on a relationship that's not very strong. Do you think that's a fair assessment? And how would you set about paying attention to the political imperative, which is to acknowledge and accept the Brexit vote if you're a Conservative government? You would build a better relationship with the European Union that can help trade and other objectives.
I do worry about it, and I do think it's an extremely important role that the Foreign Office and our diplomatic service now has, is to recalibrate a relationship with European Union countries, so that instead of being a sort of unruly tenant inside the house, as we were for 40 years, we become a sort of good neighbor. That would be the ideal. And I think there are various, if you like, internal bureaucratic steps that need to be taken and sort of have been taken, which is to get rid of a separate Brexit department and say that the Foreign Office is now running all our foreign policy, including this very important part of foreign policy. And hopefully in the course of this year, we will sort out Northern Ireland and therefore move on to a more normal relationship and get the TCA working properly. And at that point, what I think is really important is to establish the areas where we do have common interest. One of which is being shown very much at the moment is clearly defence and security, where it's massively and unarguably in Britain's interest to have good, not just good relationships, but habitual and instinctive cooperation with other European democracies. If we don't have that, then our own security will be lessened. So, I would, and there may well be other areas where European cooperation is going to be hugely important. Immigration is another one. The environment is clearly a third one, where I think we as a country should be very proactive and saying, okay, the EU will have a 5-year program on the environment. We're going to do this. How can we plug into yours so that we're all moving in at the same speed in the same direction? And I think to that extent, we should treat Europe the way we treat anyone else, with the very large caveat that it's our neighbour. So therefore, we should be even more careful about ensuring good relations with them than anywhere else in the world. And the danger, of course, is that post-Brexit, and this isn't just a feeling in Britain, but a feeling in European Union countries as well, is that, okay, we've had this row, we've had this divorce, and so therefore you're bottom of the queue rather than top of the queue for the need for cooperation, and that would be damaging for the European Union and very damaging for Britain. So I hope that cool heads prevail on both sides of the channel.
Mark, let me ask you to host a few of the questions. I've got some others as well if we have time. So let's see where we go.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just come back to one that we've asked, for those who joined late, we've asked if you have a question to post it down below on the Q&A. There are some coming in. I just want to come back to the point you made about what are good models for international cooperation. And I wonder what your take was on COP26, in that I can't quite make up my mind. Is it I could view it positively or negatively. You could say, well, at least there was an agreement and it moved the direction of travel was agreed and there was an action agreement. Or you could say, yeah, but actually two countries, India and China, sort of just vetoed a lot of the changes that want to be made, and so progress was pretty limited. I wonder what your view was about that.
I think narrowly on COP26, it went better than I thought it would. I would give it 7 or 8 out of 10. Clearly it didn't achieve everything. But it would have been extraordinary. It would have been a sort of historic success for Alok Sharma and British diplomacy if India and China had signed up to 2050 and the rest of the world had signed up to it in ways that were credible, with a proper glide path to it. And the fact that so much was achieved on things like deforestation and so on, I think these are genuine achievements. And you're right, of course, about India and in particular China. But I observe that this week we've heard that last year China built more wind power than the rest of the world put together over the past 20 years. If the Chinese put their energy and their sort of economic dynamism into renewables, then they will do it very thoroughly. And I've seen some commentary. I'm not a particular China expert, but I have seen some commentary that the way Xi will operate is he'll set himself a target of 2060 in the full knowledge that he wants to hit 2050, because that will be sort of place in history stuff. I mean, he is one of those leaders who is in permanent caring about his legacy mode. So, as I say, in general, COP26 left me surprised and a bit cheerful afterwards.
But I guess the wider point is, that would be a model that could apply elsewhere. I mean, there are other organisations that are a bit like that, but it sounds like the kind of credit outweighs the kind of deficit for that in your mind.
Yeah, it does, and you're right that as a model, you can't do it too often, because trying to get 150 nations to agree on anything that isn't just motherhood and apple pie is very difficult. So you don't want to spend that's what global government will be like, and quite apart from the as it were the biological reasons, there are just practical reasons why it's not a way to run anything. But nevertheless, on very big matters that can only be sorted globally, then it's a model that sort of works.
So a couple of questions. I mean, the first is about America and what your take is on what the questioner asked about President Biden's apparent continuation of an isolationist approach to global affairs. Do you have that?
Yeah, I've never in my adult life have I been as depressed about American politics as I am now. I'm, like many politicians on both sides of the aisle, as it were, certainly many conservative politicians, I am instinctively pro-American, and I love the place and I love the people. And I think its political system is failing itself, and it's failing the world at the moment. America is still preeminent and so important that when America goes through a bad period, a lot of us go through a bad period as well, and that's what we're doing. don't need to rehearse the problems with Trump, though nothing became him as ill as his leaving of office and attempting to mount a coup in the world's largest, oldest and large democracy. It was just monstrous behaviour, and the fact that at the moment you get very short odds on him returning to the White House in 2 years' time should depress us all hugely. And Biden, to address the question directly, I think his almost, it seems, unthinking continuation of a lot of Trump's foreign policy. It's basically Trumpism, only it's polite. It doesn't appear to bear any greater regard for international alliances, and nor is he going to frighten anyone, because he's not going to say mad things to them like Trump did occasionally, and occasionally knocked a few people into shape with it. So it is very depressing. I mean, I think Afghanistan was a historic error of pulling out like that, and then claiming not to have known what's going on, just telling me, you, and the rest of the world that Western intelligence, or particularly American intelligence services, are either useless or they have no line into people that matter in the American administration. And either of those propositions is terrifying.
Yeah.
Last year was a very bad year for Western democracy. If America goes isolationist or stays isolationist, then I don't know where we are, because NATO, weirdly, in the last 3 weeks, NATO has been doing probably what it should have done 6 months ago towards Ukraine, but at least has shown a degree of purpose that you might have thought had gone, and I suspect Putin thought had gone. So it hasn't gone. That is encouraging. In a weird way, one of the more encouraging developments in terms of security in Europe is the coming into government of the Greens in Germany, since they appear to be the most hard-headed German political party in ways that feel odd, sitting in the UK and knowing what our own Green Party would do if it were in power. But actually, they seem to have a better grasp of the Russian threat than either of the two bigger German political parties. So, in a way, that will help NATO as well. But the truth is, without a forward-looking America willing to assert itself in the world and confident in its own values, then the rest of the democracies in the West, and indeed I'm using the West in the ideological sense, not the geographical sense, the democracies around the world are weakened. So I'd like to end this on a note of hope, saying but at the moment the next election is going to be between a Democrat who will probably be too left-wing for the American mainstream, and Trump. And that is an unutterably grisly choice. I mean, it's an unutterably grisly choice for America, but also for those of us in the world who both wish America well and depend to some extent on its power and willingness to use that power to keep the world reasonably safe.
Okay, interesting. And just switching back to free trade, one of the other questions is that from someone in Canada, President Britain has formalised its trade agreement with Australia, making headway with New Zealand, and just as a rollover with Canada. And they're asking what you think about the prospects of those kind of the three agreements to be kind of confirmed into one. So you have a sort of CANZUK free trade agreement which covers the four different countries at the same time.
I think it's probably unlikely in that all four of those countries will have trade deals with others that would presumably have to be renegotiated if we tried to amalgamate every bit of the agreement between us with others. We will make agreements on lamb with New Zealand that may or may not accord with whatever deal Canada has got within NAFTA or something like that. So I'm not sure they will necessarily be pulled together, though of course one of Britain's stated aims is to join the Pacific Rim, the TCPOP, which is a sort of multilateral trade organization. And the noises I hear from inside the government are that they are quietly optimistic about that. And so we could find ourselves in a multilateral trade organization, which we have joined from the outside. And that would obviously increase quite significantly, includes Japan, the areas of the world in with which we have sort of fully free trade.
Okay, I just want to come back to a point you were making before about subsidiarity, more at a sort of UK level. I see that the levelling up paper is supposed to contain more proposals for local democracy. I see more mayors and the like, and of course there have been some successes in the terms of mayors who actually have a profile on Andy Burnham, Ben Houcher, and Andy Street and the like. I wonder what your view was. Whether that is a good it is a good model. Will it be better for many of the parts of the country where perhaps they don't have that moment, or is it? I just always wonder whether, thinking back to the police commissioners, which were always muted, that was supposed to be the great revolution. Of course, no one's taken the blindest bit of notice, and hardly anybody votes. I just wonder whether it's actually the effort that will go into constructing those, is that actually worthwhile?
I think mayors have worked in urban areas, and perhaps particularly in the bigger urban areas, and I think they've worked in practical terms because you've got someone local who can take some decisions, and also they've given a sense of identity to regions, and both of those are good. I think applying them to more diffuse rural areas or areas that consist of a load of small towns would be a mistake, and like you, I've heard that's going to be in the levelling up white paper. And I've had colleagues who've been called in to say, your area is going to be blessed with, I don't know whether you call it a mayor, I mean, it's almost a governor of a larger area, but you produce one for, say, the East Midlands, which would be based in Leicester. And when you draw that region on a Whitehall map, it goes to the suburbs of Manchester, and people who live there, who will be commuting into Manchester to work, the last thing they need is some politician they've never heard of sitting in Leicester deciding how their bus service is run. And which gives me the second reason why I would advise against that, not applying it as a universal model across the country, is if you're doing that, whose powers are you taking away? Either you're simply adding another level of politician and therefore a bit of expense, with no sort of levers to pull and no budgets to spend, or you need to take the powers away from someone, and good luck with trying to tell every county council, good luck particularly for Conservative government, telling the mass of Conservative county council leaders that we've got this great idea for regional government, we're going to replicate the successes of the mayors all over your counties, and your organisation has disappeared, and so therefore, like many, if that is what is in the white paper, I will wager lunch at a restaurant of your choice, Mark, that in 5 years' time, none of these things are actually up and running.
Very good. We've got a couple of minutes left. Danny, did you want to just chip in with any final questions or thoughts you might have?
I did wonder about this whole idea of the race to the bottom, Damien, because one of the ideas is that if we have these free trade organizations, they're trying to liberate the amount of free trade. We have no weaker global institutions that are implementing social policy because we can't make them democratically accountable. Do we then end up in a race to the bottom where everyone thinks, well, the best thing that we can do is to cut our taxes and social infrastructure in order to be a competitive haven for business, and there's no international way of preventing that from happening. So you get a highly competitive world economy, which obviously has its advantages as well. And some of us might argue, better advantages than the other policy. But you also get a race to the bottom in regulatory terms.
don't think you do. And I think I'm conscious I've been really gloomy over the last 45 minutes. My last sort of vestiges of optimism are that people go through that phase of economic development, but want to get out of it as fast as possible. And once you're out of it, as Britain has been for the last century and a half, you absolutely would have it would be bad policy and bad politics to go back into it. For example, if we sign trade deals with people that involve importing food, which we do, then we are not going to let them pump food or either treat their animals badly or pump their food full of stuff that we wouldn't allow, because it wouldn't be allowed in our market and our consumers wouldn't want it. And I do think there's a bit of a sort of slightly naive national delusion in the thought, that we have all these high standards, but all these other people are absolutely terrible. And you know what? I don't observe Americans poisoning themselves with the chicken they eat. Australians seem perfectly healthy to me when they've got England at 88-7 on the first day of every test match of the Ashes series. So this idea that other countries have lower welfare standards than we do, and also social standards as well, that if you want to be a global player, if you want global Britain, then one of the things you want is inward investment. And one of the things companies look at is not just, do we have cheap workers, but what sort of society are we sending our managers into? And so if you have a sort of very, very night watchman state type country, then you will certainly end up with much greater inequality and therefore quite likely higher levels of crime and dirtier streets and all the things when, if you said, are we going to put our factory here or somewhere else, would make you think, I'm not coming to work here, and I'm not going to send any of my managers over there to work there. So I think enlightened self-interest would suggest don't go down that route. And I think one of the most misused and overused phrases is Singapore on Thames, which I think which has become shorthand for a completely deregulated, low tax, devil take the hindmost society, which is not at all what Singapore is like. Singapore is actually a highly regulated society. And one of the reasons why their tax rates are so low is that there's a lot of compulsory insurance. And if you add that compulsory insurance onto the tax rate, it's not out of kilter with other advanced societies. So this idea that there is some sort of successful model along those lines, it seems to me a complete myth.
Okay, one last thing, if I may, Mark, and this idea of global Britain, this slogan that's now used by the government and was used during the Brexit referendum, does it mean anything, or is it just words?
It can mean something, in that, it will mean a lot of trade deals. It can mean that Britain is outward looking and doesn't turn in on itself. And I assume it's meant to mean we have a generous attitude towards the world, and we want to share. Now, it's quite an expensive ambition, because to do it, we'll not only need to sign trade deals that will involve doing deals with people, and we will need to run our society in a way that makes it popular to come here. But it would also need an increase in our hard power. We spent 20 years running down the armed services. We will need to start building them up again if we're significant about that. And it will also need probably even more devotion to our soft power. And one of my constant battles throughout my political life within the Tory party is that I don't understand why Tories diss the BBC. The two institutions that people have most respect for around the world in Britain are the Queen and the BBC, and therefore any sensible conservative and patriotic and wanting a global Britain will think, what can we do to make the BBC a bigger player in the world media game, rather than just attack it because they didn't like an interview Nick Robinson did on the Today programme this morning. And that's true of other institutions like the British Council as well. We do have a lot of soft power. We're good at that sort of thing. And it seems to me one of the things a government with a coherent global Britain strategy would do would be to say what institutions actually sell Britain around the world and what can we do to help them. And I put this politely, I haven't yet detected that there's much impetus towards that inside the government.
Okay, Mark, back to you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that. I know you said you felt you were unnecessarily gloomy, but I think there was quite a lot of optimism in many of the things that you said, even if it's just a gentle prod towards the optimistic side. So thank you both of you for what I thought was a fascinating discussion. I mean, you don't often get many interviews that start with a question of what's your view about a kind of global government, but we certainly covered quite like a tour de force, kind of a multitude of different subjects, from COP26 to the intricacies of the Kent Police. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the questions that came in. I'm sorry we didn't quite get to all of them, but it's been a fascinating session, and I look forward to welcoming you to the next one some point in the future. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mark, for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you, Damien.